welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Noor Hamad.
And my name is Lamal Hello.
Today, inshallah, we will be presenting about Romanticism. It will be a historical background and definition, and the characteristics too.
So first of all, as Dr. Ayman just said, do you know what age precedes the Romantic age? Can someone say? Yes, Fatma. Exactly. So Neoclassicism was a period of literature that preceded the Romantic age. Basically, it was a literary movement that appeared in the 17th and 18th century. To sum it up, they believed that the best kind of poetry and literature was the Greek and Roman literature. So they thought that classic literature was unmatchable. I would like to also press that imagination was also not generally accepted in their society.
Right, go back a little bit. Right, so why are they called neoclassicals? Not neoclassicals, neoclassicals, right? The classical literature is the Greek literature and the Roman literature.
Yep.
This is what we call it what? The classical literature. These people, they appreciated the neoclassical, right? As well as, right, the Roman literature, right? And they thought that it is unequaled. What do we mean by unequal? That no matter human beings try to write literature, they will never excel in writing literature as the Romans and the Greeks did. And therefore, what is the best way, right, of writing literature according to their own perception and
Following
understanding?
the classical literature.
It is to imitate. It is to imitate the qualities of the classical literature, whether it is Greek or it is Roman. And therefore, they are called the neoclassicals, right, or the modern classicals. The modern classicals. They never had, a kind of literature of their own. Yeah, they have some qualities that they prefer, right? But they thought that the best unmatchable type of literature, it was the classical literature, and this is why they are called what? Neoclassicals. This is the reason behind the naming, of the movement as a whole. But what are the other qualities that they believed in, right? The things that they believed in. Please start.
So now I'll take you to the major characteristics of this era for more understanding of their type of literature. Number one, we have emotional restraint or Platonism. Now, we mentioned previously in the previous classes that Plato had a theory, and his theory was to reject emotions and feelings from literature, right? And he wanted literature to be totally reasonable and rational, and to be dominated by reason. So emotional restraint or Platonism, which is a major characteristic of this era, meant to reject emotions and feelings from literature. So they wanted their literature or their work to be totally reasonable and rational. Number two, order. Now, order means to have a specific form for writing. So the writers followed a specific form in procedures, yes, when writing literature. They wrote poetry and they wrote prose, and they followed those procedures in writing. So they had a very specific form of writing. Logic. They wanted their literature or their literary works to be logical, which means that they wanted it to be away from emotions and to make sense. Okay?
Yeah, to be intellectual.
To be intellectual.
Similar to what the opposite of emotional restraint.
Yeah.
Right?
And then we have clarity. Clarity is like it actually surprised me that it's one of the major characteristics of this era. Clarity means that what is said is meant.
Yes.
So we can say that they actually didn't really pay attention to the figures of speech, like irony, metaphors. So they wrote things and they meant what they wrote. Okay, so the diction has only one level of understanding. What is of meaning. So what is said is meant. Then we have dignity. their literature was wrote to be read by the upper classes or the noble families.
Actually, right, I have to say something here. Right, dignity is not only referring to the orator, right? I mean, to whom it is written. But, right, the writers of that time, they were courtiers. What do you mean by courtiers?
Yeah.
High
Yeah, the
class.
upper class, and they left, right, in the royal court, in the royal court. And you cannot imagine that the number of writers at that time, right, was actually not many writers, and the readers are as well, right? You can imagine this happened 400 or 500 years ago, right? Which means that the readers were also from the upper class, right? Right. And the topic, if it is written by some people in the upper class to some people, right, readers who are in the upper class, the topics are going to be about, right,
The upper
class at first, right? So it was written by the elite, for the elite, about the elite, right? This is what we call it what? Dignity. Something else, dignity related to the type of the language that they use.
Yeah.
The language is a dignified court language, right? We call it is characterized by sublimity. What do we mean by sublimity? That it is high standard, right? Which is not common to common readers, right? And therefore, it is also another characteristic, right? Which is, right, colors this movement and makes it different from the other movements before and after. You have to remember that the people before them, they were Elizabethans. They were the greatest people who ever wrote drama at that time. I'm sorry for this, right? And therefore you have to understand that these people are coming between two great ages, right? One was, which is the Elizabethan age, and the other one is the Romantic age. And in the middle, they are having, right, their characteristics of austerity, dignity, which is not actually appealing to everyone.
Thank you. I'd like to pinpoint that since they are actually imitating the Greek and Roman literature, it's very normal to see that they are writing about elites for elites, and written by elites, of course. Now, sublimity of diction, it means that the level of the language they are using is high because, as I mentioned previously, they are addressing the upper classes. Then form over content. They had a specific form or order for every type of literature. So for poetry, they had a specific form. For prose or drama or the other types of literature, they also had specific forms. So these are the major characteristics of the Neoclassicism era. Now, Romanticism. Romanticism is the era that came after the Neoclassicism. It held some contradictory ideas to the previous era. So Romanticism came as a counter movement against the Neoclassicals and their theories, and it had a lot of contradictory ideas. For example, they didn't have a specific form. They actually rejected the idea of having a specific form to write, and their literature in general was filled with emotions and feelings. They wrote about emotions and feelings, and they were in kind of worshipping nature.
So when you hear the word romantic or romanticism, if you don't know anything about the age or subject, what is the first thing that springs to your mind? What do you think they would possibly talk about?
Love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Romance and love. Exactly. But actually, the Romantic age and the term romanticism had very little to do with romance and love itself. Although occasionally you can see love appearing in some of the poems and the art in the Romantic age, but if you come to the actual literary theory and the history of the Romantic age, you won't find it much, and you would see that the term Romanticism and the Romantic age itself were very distinct and different from each other. So basically, if you want to define Romanticism, you're going to say it's a movement of the 18th and 19th century that marked the reaction in literature, philosophy, art, religion, and politics from the Neoclassicism and formal orthodoxy of the preceding period.
Okay.
So,
Explain it.
come back.
Yeah.
So it didn't just cover only love and romance. It covered philosophy, art, religion, and politics. And it actually come out and broke the formal orthodoxy of the Neoclassicism period that came before it. So it
And-
basically just what Noor explained.
Yeah.
And-
I
and-
mean that we don't want only to read, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
We need to give more information.
Yeah, we're gonna
It's
say it.
very easy to explain, to give more details
Yeah, exactly.
about what.
And as Lama mentioned, this era brought a lot of changes to the political life and the religious life of this era. They rejected reason. They didn't really reject reason, but they preferred emotions and feelings. They preferred to be in a good relationship with nature, to escape the city life into the countryside life, or the nature, the life of nature. And when it comes to religion, as I mentioned, some people describe them as worshippers of nature. They loved nature. They took nature as a creed. And in the philosophy, when it comes to philosophy and literature, as I mentioned, reason was not really important for them. They didn't follow a specific form in writing, and
Neither logic. They never cut about logic,
yeah, exactly,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, if you remember, we took Introduction to Literature that they loved imagination. They even
Yeah.
decided to primary imagination and secondary imagination.
Excellent.
They were spontaneous. They didn't come from logic and form, but whatever they felt, they wrote.
Yes,
So-
Zahra, please.
We also have studied about this era.
Yeah.
They have one of its characteristics is
Transcendentalism. But this is in the United States, not in England. The transcendental movement, right, is in the United States, which is what we call it, the United States Romanticism is called transcendentalism. But, right, I mean the British people, they are called as romantics. Yeah.
So I would like to mention that the Romanticism, as Zahra and Professor mentioned, it was not only in England or Britain. There was
All over the world.
this movement.
All over Europe.
like-
Originated in Germany.
Yeah, and it has a very, very good and influence in France. For example, you can see Romanticism in the literary works of Victor Hugo, and he's actually considered the very romantic,
And
writer
even the
of
Arab
that.
world. Right? Do you know who is the great leader of the Romanticism in the Arab world?
It's the first time.
Right. This is a good question that I would like to ask to see your public information. Right?
Actually, it's the first time.
Arabic literature. Right? Who is the leader of Romanticism in the Arab literature? Zatabani. This is a mistake that you are doing in this class that I don't accept. Why? Because Nizar Qabbani has nothing to do with romanticism. It has something to do with passion.
Yeah.
And it is completely different from what? From romanticism. Right? We explained this at the beginning. Right? When we asked you what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you listen to the word romanticism, and you said love.
Love
But
is
it
about
not
passion.
actually about love.
Yeah.
Right? Yes.
I believe السياب أو في كمان مع واحدة
We're not talking about the 20th century. No, I'm not talking about the 20th century. I'm talking about the same age. Right? The same age. عمركم سمعتوا بواحد اسمه مصطفى لطفي المنفلوطي؟ مين مصطفى لطفي المنفلوطي؟
We have no clue.
أنا بس ما قلنا No, right? The one who wrote العبرات والنظرات وتحت ظلال الزيزفون ومسجودين. These are great books that you need to read, right, in order to be good, English producer. What I mean, English literature producers, you cannot be good in the English literature unless you are good in your own native language literature. So if you want to know what's the meaning of romanticism, in general, you need to read most of
Yeah.
right? Go and bump the books, right, from the library. Read them in Arabic. They are very interesting, very touching, right? So you will find that the principles of romanticism, which were mentioned, for example, right, in the preface to the lyrical ballads, the book which was written by Samuel Coleridge and William Wordsworth, right? They are revealed through the works of what Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti. Although, by the way, most of his own writings are translations from French, except for Al-Nazarat and Al-Abarat. Nazarat and Al-Abarat, they are written originally by, right, his own production. But the other novels, right, they were translated from the French, right? But it is not only a translation. So anyone who can say, Lord Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti, for example, was a good translator, no, he rewrote, right, the novels. He rewrote the novels from the French literature, right, but in according to the Romantic principles. Romantic principles. I hope that someone is going to make a presentation one day about Mustafa al-Manfaluti here, right, as something related to the Arab literature. Because we don't need to say that Romanticism is only related to the European countries. No, we have a great, great name.
Dr. I would like to share.
Good, sharing or a presentation?
A presentation.
Good, Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti.
Yeah, but not the linguistic class.
No, not that, after we finish Romanticism.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's great that Doctor mentioned that you have to master your mother language first. Last year I read something about learning a new language, and the writer said that if you want to master a new language, go and master your mother language first, because it's the only way you can understand and master a new language.
And they don't know, those who don't know, right, their own native tongue, literature, and the grammar, they won't excel in English language and literature. Make sure that this is something which is inevitable in order to be distinguished, right? In your major, you have to be distinguished in your Arabic language and literature and the grammar, right?
Exactly. So if we come back to the term Romanticism itself and how scholars and historians used it while studying that period, we can see that they argued a lot about it and used it in many different ways. So some people even suggested that why should we call it Romanticism if it doesn't talk about romance and love and passion? But the reality is, even if we drop this label of Romanticism, it would not make the period any less complex than it is about the variety of subjects that it covers.
So the German poet Schullage, who is given credit for first using this term, or the Romantic or Romanticism, described this literature and defined it as literature depicting emotional matter in an imaginative form.
Yeah.
Now, this means that
This is the
literature...
definition of the school. This is the definition of the whole school.
Now, this actually sums up everything. Now, it means that this literature portrays or tries to portray emotions and feelings and what we feel towards nature and towards other people in an imaginative way, or in an imaginative form. So they used both emotions, feelings, and imagination in this literature.
By the way, Romanticism, all right, the last identified writer of Romanticism is called Walter Scott.
Yeah.
And he died late, right, in the Victorian age. And this theory has been given the name after the death of Walter Scott. But at that time, they were never known as Romantics or Romanticism. But the name was given after the death of Sir Walter Scott. Right? Good. Good enough.
Now, many of the age's foremost writers like Blake and Shelley, Hunt, Keats, and Wordsworth, these are actually considered the greatest writers in this age. They expected that something new is going to begin, or is going to come, a new age of literature, of writing, and a lot of changes in life in general, whether the political life or literature, philosophy. They expected that there was something new and different, distinguished, going to begin. William Blake said that a new heaven is begun. And this actually was matched a generation later when, with Shelley's quote, the words, great age begins anew. And Keats also, referring to Hunt and Wordsworth, said, these will give the world another heart.
And they dead.
Yes.
And they dead.
Okay.
So, in our introduction to literature course, I don't know if any of you remember when exactly did we take that Romanticism began. I'm not asking about the year, but do you remember what work was published that started the Romantic Age?
I just mentioned that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
All right? Yes, go ahead.
so exactly, it began with the lyrical ballads that Wordsworth and Coleridge published, and you could consider it ended with Sir Walter Scott, that Doctor just mentioned. When he died, we can consider that Romantic Age maybe could have stopped or ended. But if you want to cover the actual literary context itself and its effect, it could have covered a broader time span.
So
Right, hold on. I would like to say something. What's the meaning of lyrical ballads? Lyrical ballads. We know that poetry
They-
is divided into many types.
yeah.
The lyric, right? The epic, the ballad, right? The dramatic, right? That each type is different from the other, right? According to the rules, which has been already built since the time of Aristotle. But these people, Romantics, right, they revolted not only against Roman Neoclassical period, but they also revolted against the literary heritage of what? Of the Western world. Right? They wanted to have a new beginning for a new literature of their own, completely different from the previous, right? What we call it canon, or let me call it the previous literary tradition. Literary tradition.
Yeah.
So they never, right, took rules as they were. That lyric is supposed to be different from the ballad.
Ballads, yeah.
So they started a new type of poetry, which is
Lyrical ballads.
lyrical ballads, right? Although the ballad is a narrative story, right, that talks about, right, some social or religious, right, or story, right, which is different from the epic. Also, it is narrative, but it is heroic. It is heroic. And the lyric is a song, a Greek song, right? It is originally written to be sung, right? So the story and the song cannot be combined. But these people, they said, yeah, we can combine them. And they started their book, right? What we call it, the first manifesto of the whole school. The manifesto? Declaration, right? Of the whole school. It is called Lyrical Ballads. And it is written by whom? By two people. One is called Samuel Coleridge, and another one called William Morton. And both of them, they put the principles of the theory in the introduction to the book, right? So all, right, the principles of Romanticism, you can find it in the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, right? Good.
Exactly. So the publishing of this was actually breaking form and tradition, just like the doctor just said. So,
I'd like to pinpoint this, the fact that it affects the effect of this era covered a broader time span. Now, the Romanticism or the rules of the Romantic era didn't just affect the Romantics themselves or the people and the writers who lived in that age. It actually, it affected the modernism too, and the modernism movement considers the Romanticism movement or this age as a great age, despite the fact that a lot of writers and a lot of scholars didn't really like this age. Like you know, as Lema mentioned previously, some people are still till today believing that Romanticism has a lot to do with love and that the writers are actually crossing the borders with their writing. But that's absolutely...
And some other people, they consider them as dreamers, losers. They consider them as losers. Yeah, maybe a brilliant losers, but at the end they are
losers.
A loser is a loser.
So, but to be more exact about the exact time that Romantic starts, you can say that it started from the end of the 18th century all the way up to the 1870s. And the primary vehicle of expression of Romanticism in England was poetry.
Yeah, I'd like to mention that, I mentioned this previously, in France, Victor Hugo was the major Romantic, and the primary vehicle of expression in France was in novel or in prose. So, Romantic has in fact been used since the Renaissance So this term is not really new. It has been used since the Renaissance. I guess you remember the Renaissance period, Queen Elizabeth and the movements. Yeah. So to suggest the free expression of the imagination, but they didn't really use this term in a positive way or in a positive form. They used this term to refer to negative thoughts, to negative beliefs and imagination. So romantic imaginings were thought to interfere with the clarity of art form, and so lay beyond the bounds. As I mentioned, they thought that romantics crossed the boards with their literary works and with their writing. And some scholars, and I actually heard this from a previous student. She said that her doctor mentioned that romantics in the, I guess, the Romanticism class, that they misrepresented women, for example, in their poetry and novels, which is
right. Hold on. Right. This is right a kind of feministic point of view regarding right what we call it romanticism. I do agree that many people, they have this belief, right, that they were losers, they were dreamers, they were unrealistic, living in a world of their own. And at the same time, you will find some other people, they still believe that they are the best writers ever in the history of the English literature, right? They believe that what they wrote was really great and it will continue to be great for ages to come. And therefore, we might have a kind of difference in the views, and we are not supposed to take things for granted, right?
True.
Wait till you read their own literature and make a judgment of your own, right? Don't rely on the judgments of other critics, but we need to help you to form
your own opinion,
judgment, right?
Okay. Okay. So since the Romantics opposed the Enlightenment, I'd like to mention that the Enlightenment age also was dominated by reason. We mentioned this actually in the introduction to literature. They were dominated by reason. Reason was there in their literature. Feelings were totally, and emotions were totally abandoned from their poetry. So they actually followed the idea of Platonism. So they often focused on emotions. These are the Romantics, of course. They focused on emotions and dreams as opposed to rationalism. And other important motifs in German Romanticism are traveling, nature, and ancient myths. So myths were also there, and myths and legends were also there in the Romantic literature. Nature and traveling, especially in the German literature.
So there is a quote about the characteristics of Romanticism, to be exact, by William Blake. He said, "To generalize is to be an idiot, and to particularize is a lone distinction of a merit." So how we understood this is maybe in Neoclassicism.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, how we understood it when we read this quote is maybe to generalize is to be an idiot. So he was maybe referring to the Neoclassicism age. When they were generalizing people, they didn't care about the individual. So, but then the Romanticism came and they particularized people. They particularized their emotions and feelings and how the individual feels toward the society. Exactly. So that's how we took the quote in order to introduce us to the characteristics.
And by the way, William Blake is a pre-romantic poet.
Exactly, yeah.
He is not a romantic. I mean that he was writing his own poetry
before,
right? I mean,
the Romantic age started.
Making the theory. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's wrong. Okay. So the characteristics of this era. No other period in English literature had a diversity in form and in characteristics more than and in style, theme, content than the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. And now, furthermore, no period has been the topic of so much disagreement disagreement and confusion over its defining principles and aesthetics. So as I mentioned before, this era, a lot of people agree with the principles of this era and a lot of people disagree. And the term Romanticism itself is actually controversial. You know, a lot of people have, agree with the principles that came with this definition, with this term and with this era. And other people are like literally stick to their to their thoughts and beliefs that Romanticism has to do with love, has to do with with passion and other things. So what are the defining principles of this era? Imagination, emotions and feelings, freedom freedom of writing, freedom of form, and certainly the focal points of Romanticism. Any list of particular characteristics of the literature of Romanticism includes subjectivity, as Professor mentioned. They cared about the idea of individuality and subjectivity. They wanted to express their emotions and their own experience in life and how they felt about nature and their relationship with others and so on. Solitary life rather than life in society, as I mentioned, they preferred to escape. They actually call them the escapists because they escaped the city life into the countryside life. They preferred nature. And the beliefs that imagination is superior to reason. As I mentioned, they didn't really reject reason, but they preferred to be creative, imaginative, and to express their feelings in a free way. And devotion to beauty, love, and worship of nature. A lot of people call them worshippers of nature, and they appreciated beauty, especially the beauty of nature.
So just like the doctor just said, the adaptation of Romanticism started in Germany. So thanks to German culture theorists, Romanticism was adopted all over through Europe and the entire world. And the negative components that it had during the Elizabethan time were actually removed, and it lost it, and they started seeing in a new positive way. So we wanted to end our presentation with a paragraph. Everything we said. So what we can take from our knowledge of this artful time period is that Romanticism emphasizes emotion over reason, sensory experience before intellect. We said Neoclassicism loved intellectual stuff. So imagination as a road to experience and spiritual truth. The human personality, moods, depths, ethnic and national cultures, and the attitudes and the help of the world understand each other. So they wanted the world to understand each other more through emotions.
Yeah, symbolism, surrealism, and modernism are combined themes that strengthen the creation that we take for granted. So symbolism, as I mentioned, in the Neoclassicism and the characteristics, clarity was one major characteristic they had.
This is why
they
the counter movement.
Yeah, so they didn't really, and in the previous
So you will
period.
find, for example, William Blake is the one who, the most person who used symbolism.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I wonder as.
I wonder lonely like a cloud.
Yeah, I wonder.
No, I'm talking about William Blake.
Or
Not
Who said this?
William Blake, not William Wordsworth.
okay, but they use symbols basically.
Yeah,
Alright.
they
but
use
not like
symbolism a lot.
William Blake.
Yeah.
William Blake is the father of symbolism.
Yeah, okay.
So the previous era didn't really pay attention to the figures of speech, symbolism, metaphors, irony, and so on. But the Romantics actually, you can find symbolism a lot in their, in their literary works. And modernism, as I mentioned, the movement of modernism appreciated Romanticism as literature and as a movement.
It is a
So,
major. It is a major.
What? Okay, so it's a major influence on the world that we live in today and will be relevant for centuries to come. So this, the changes that this movement brought were not, specific or were not.
So it didn't end just with Scott dying. So it just today its effects are still here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alive and kicking.
Exactly.
And it's really, really great that this movement brought a lot of changes whether to the writing, literature, or to the life itself. And okay.
very good.
Okay, so I'd like to mention that they didn't really, I said that Platonism was not part of their characteristics because they appreciated emotions and feelings, and since they didn't really follow a specific form, and they rejected actually the idea of form and having an order to follow when writing. But they didn't reject Aristotle because Aristotle appreciated the idea of creativity, emotions, feelings, and literature. Have a nice day, young ladies.
Thank you, both Lama and Noor. I really appreciate it. Please upload your presentation to the group and make sure that you download it and print it for yourself. It will be part of the material that you will be handed down. This is going to be a general introduction to Romanticism, but the details will follow later, inshallah. Fatima, you need to upload your presentation as well to the group, right? Thank you very much. See you next time, inshallah.